your incredible leadership on this issue. This past year has demonstrated to the world what you already knew, what you were already fighting for, which is that we must fix our broken criminal justice system in this city and across the country. And I'm inspired and moved by your leadership. So thank you for joining today for this important conversation. Look, let's be clear that New Yorkers deserve to live in a city that is safe, inclusive, and equitable for everyone. And while New York has been the safest large city in the United States in many ways over the last decade, this summer's protests against racial injustice, the repeated instances that we saw of unjustified police force, and the long-standing overrepresentation of people of color and individuals with mental health challenges in our courts and jails demonstrate that the current system is broken. New York City's next mayor must do three things: reimagine a public safety system that is truly community-driven, reduce over-policing and over-incarceration, and reinvest in services that provide safe and healthy communities for all New Yorkers. I will ensure that New York City's justice system works for everyone by prioritizing safety, inclusion, and racial equity. We have to put the justice back in criminal justice policy. We have to promote civic engagement and transparency and emphasize data and technology innovation in a way that uses public resources wisely and fairly. We must also recognize that crime and violence are caused primarily by cycles of trauma, systemic absence of opportunity, and lack of legitimacy of governing institutions. Too often, responses have revolved solely around law enforcement, ignored these driving forces, and made matters worse with heavy-handed, racially disproportionate enforcement. Too often, we've asked police and public safety personnel to address social and community issues they are not equipped to handle, such as mental health, homelessness, and school safety. My administration will reduce over-policing and over-incarceration, close the Rikers jails, and ensure that individuals have access to affordable housing, healthcare, job development, and critical social services to help prevent contact with the criminal legal system and cycles of incarceration in the first place. As mayor, I will also establish a comprehensive citywide response system for mental health emergencies so that police aren't asked to assume a role of mental health professional or social worker. If we do all these things, and we will under a Donovan administration, we can reduce the role of the police in our communities. We can reimagine what policing looks like and our criminal justice system, and reinvest in our communities that will end the cycle of incarceration. That is my commitment as mayor, and I couldn't be more excited to have this amazing group here today to talk about this platform and how we move it forward to make it reality. So, Karume, thank you again. Really appreciate your leadership and doing this. Look forward to the conversation.
Outstanding. Well, thank you, Shaun, for laying out the platform. And I will certainly say just my work on the ground. I didn't also mention I'm with the Bronx Defenders, a supervising attorney there. And these are the kinds of changes that I think that many people on the ground want to see happen. But let's dive right into the discussion. And I want to start this question actually with Shanequa. Let's talk about police in schools. Many communities consider the presence of police in schools to be at the heart of the school-to-prison pipeline. Should we continue to have police in schools? And if not, what alternatives should be put in place to ensure student safety and prevent youth from being involved in the criminal legal system?
So thank you for that. Thank you for that question. First and foremost, no, police officers do not need to be in schools that should be fostering a learning environment. The root of the problem that happens as it pertains to criminal activity or behavior that can be interpreted as criminal activity is usually the lack of resources in the first place, the lack of um, adequate personnel that can deal with our young people who have emotional issues. We definitely in marginalized communities that are high in color are criminalized for emotional behavior. I have a community center that is located in the 15th Council District in the Bronx. And 1 out of 5 students that are in schools local to where I live experience homelessness. Our children are homeless. If our children are homeless and our children have nowhere to relate to in terms of their living environment and situation, and the only time that they eat is when they're in school, coupled with the other really devastating and structural issues that they go to the young people. Police are absolutely not the answer inside of a school building, which Shaun mentioned earlier, only lends itself to the school to prison pipeline. So what are some of the alternatives that we can engage in? First of all, a community first atmosphere in a school and a learning setting would drastically reduce any incidents of crime that happen inside of the schoolhouse. And when we're dealing with young people, the other part of the equation that I was just having a conversation about this yesterday is the fact that our young people are continued to be told that they're to be seen and not heard. And so if we're not including the young people in what we believe is their solution or resolve for any problem that they have, the problem is going to continue. So we need to really be making a very bold stand about how we envision our young people to be responsible, one, for their own actions, but more importantly than that, what their futures will look like. And we can't do that when we have police arresting 6-year-olds and pepper spraying 9-year-olds. And that's the reality that they live in. That's the reality that we live in right now. So to answer your question, absolutely not. Police should not be in the school. And if we start with community first and resolve issues from the root of the problem, then we'll have less occurrences of anything that looks like crime inside of a school.
Thank you for that. And I just invite anybody else from the panel to weigh in on police in schools as well.
I think Shanequa, really articulated that very well. And just to double down on some of the points she made, I just saw an article today that Rochester is cutting hot lunches to its school students, and this is in the same city as Shanequa just mentioned, where a 9-year-old was maced by police last week, or a week within the past 2 weeks. So, when we're talking about where the resources are needed, they do not need to be going into policing. They need to be going into education. They need to be going into housing. They need to be going into providing school students with a hot lunch. And if we, on the front end can make investments, public investments, to alleviate some of the social determinants of health, we wouldn't have to worry about, things like school safety. And by the way, and it's always important to emphasize that all the data, all the research finds no correlation between police and schools and school safety. Police do not make schools safer, right? Not in the Bronx, not at Columbine, right? There were police on site at Columbine when that mass shooting happened, and they did nothing to prevent it, right? And so anywhere in America, police do not make schools safer in any context.
Now, I want to get Stephanie's take too, as the one of the people who's in the youngest person on our panel, who may be the most experienced in this issue. Stephanie, feel free to weigh in as well.
Thank you for that. I agree with what has been said. I believe that police have absolutely no place in any school environment. I think we need to disregard this myth that police exist for the purpose of protecting and serving. In schools especially, they have never protected or served anyone. They are what we need protection and servitude from. I believe that all cops need to be removed from schools. As was mentioned, they're doing harm. They're pepper spraying 9-year-olds. Cops in schools are suffocating children to death, as we saw that happened with Cornelius Fredericks. They have absolutely no place in schools. And I believe all the millions and millions of dollars that we're spending on having cops in schools should be reallocated into providing actual resources for students in need, because there's absolutely no reason that the city is spending millions of taxpayer dollars on cops in schools when there are students that don't have food, don't have books, don't have enough teachers, and aren't receiving the education that they deserve. So instead of spending millions of dollars on having police in schools that ultimately puts our students in danger, we should be spending that money on something that is actually going to help them learn and feel safe and feel loved and feel cared for in the way that all students deserve to feel when they are in a school environment.
Stephanie, all right.
Can I just give some love to that? That is speaking from the direct experience of what it's like to be in school right now, and that is something that I'm really grateful for all the input and help we've had to put this plan together. I want to be very specific about what my plan does, building on all the truth that we've just heard. I am committed to getting the police out of school. I say it in bold letters in my plan, but it isn't just about what I'm against. It's also what I'm for, that I think really builds on what Stephanie and others have said. We need a positive presence in our schools, not a presence that speaks to criminality or militarizing our schools. And that's why I've proposed what I call PPARs that really drive positivity and respect in our schools. And that's what I would reinvest that money in. But I also want to be clear that we have a compound epidemic in schools right now between the problems that existed before COVID that have been compounded by this past year and the trauma that particularly Black and Brown communities have been through. And so two other things that I'm proposing I want to be clear about is to add 150 social workers into our schools to deal with the underlying challenges that we've seen, as well as the compounding effect of the epidemic this past year. I also am proposing a really innovative plan to hire young people from the communities that have been most affected for what I call an education recovery corps, particularly given the joblessness and the challenges of COVID. We should put our young people to work helping teachers not only accelerate academic recovery, but emotional and social challenges that folks have faced this past year. So those are very specific things that walk the walk, not just talk the talk on these changes that are in the platform.
And that's exactly the kind of conversation I think that as a city we need to have. I'm really glad that we're having this conversation now. I just want to move forward. Since we're talking about resources and support, I want to shift our conversation a little bit to talking about mass incarceration. You know, a lot of the focus of that, of the debate around mass incarceration is on the entry points, over policing, the dynamics of the criminal legal system, but really not as much attention is paid to what happens when people return to their communities from incarceration, after incarceration. And Dyjuan, I want to direct this question to you to start, and everybody feel free to weigh in. But what kinds of policies and support should be put in place to help people best make that transition and to help move forward in their lives?
Yeah, so Karume, thank you for the question. And I think first and foremost, the best policy is going to be not incarcerating people in the first place, right? You know, on the current administration in New York City, de Blasio, has aided and abetted the governor in rolling back bail reform. As a result, we see the population on Rikers increasing for the simple fact that we are punishing people for poverty, right? There are individuals sitting on Rikers Island right now because they can't afford to bail themselves out, not because they're a danger to their community, not because that they're going to receive any type of rehabilitative services there, but because they can't afford to go home. So the best policy up front is not to incarcerate people in the first place, right? But when we talk about reentry, and again, we're always seem like we're having criminal justice conversations, but we're really having resource conversations, right? I'm on the board at the Fortune Society, which is the largest criminal justice organization in the country. Been doing this for a really, really long time, and is on the ground in New York City doing really, really critical reentry work, from providing supportive housing to resume writing, to job fairs, to winter coat drives, right? So that people walking off Rikers Island in the middle of winter are warm. That is something that is so basic that New York City is not even doing, right? They will send people out into the cold in a t-shirt, right? So when we're talking about reentry, it's not only about a drug program, right? It's not only about an anti-violence program. We're talking about things that are even more fundamental, right? Clothing, hot meals, housing. And so if we can move funding, as Shaun said, he supports closing Rikers. Our first priority in closing Rikers and to close that jail, and all the cost savings should be going into the communities that have been impacted by mass incarceration, right? And if we can do that and put the infrastructure in place where people are safe and secure in their communities, we're going to have less people going to prison, and we're going to have better support systems in place for people going out. At the Fortune Society, at other organizations, Osborne Society, all over New York, at the Bronx Defenders, right? We're all sitting around looking at looming budget cuts, and we know that we can't afford it, right? And the mayor is proposing a budget increase for the NYPD. That is absurd. So if we want to have people effectively reintegrated back into society, we have to allocate resources towards that goal, right? I work for the Barred Prison Initiative. We have the advantage of knowing our students for many years before they return to their communities. But even with that, and the fact that, they leave prison with an education and a degree, most of them returning to New York City, we still provide robust reentry supports, continuing education, housing support, career development support, job placement support, and 80% of our students are employed within 60 days. But that takes work and that takes resources. And those resources are primarily coming right now from private individuals. We get no money from New York State. We get some money, we've gotten some money over the past 2 years from New York City. We'd be happy to see that continue under the Donovan administration, by the way. But that is what it takes. It takes resources. If we have the resources, we have amazing organizations on the ground in New York prepared to do the work.
Well, thank you for that answer, and obviously for all of your great work that you're doing with both BART and with Fortune, Dyjuan. I want to turn it to Shanequa. Happy to hear from Stephanie, and also Shaun, I want to get your take as well.
Thank you. So in addition to making sure that folks are, not experiencing the criminal justice system to begin with, as Dyjuan just said, prevention, funds being allocated to preventative programs. When we analyze the reasons why people wind up having to deal with the criminal justice system to begin with, need to be a top priority, because the experience of the young people in my community are that their first experience with the criminal justice system happens before they're teenagers. We started a program 2 years ago called the Judge Shadow Program. And we started this program in collaboration with judges from Brooklyn Family Court. They come to do a workshop with our young people called Intro to Legal Principles. Once they get the workshop about Intro to Legal Principles, we then take our young people to Brooklyn Family Court. And why Brooklyn Family Court? Because we did work really, really hard on raise the age, although there's still some holes there, right? What we know is that a 13-year-old, and a 43-year-old should not be in the same setting in terms of criminal justice anything. And then once we take the young people to Brooklyn Family Court, they get to tour the chambers. They sit on the bench with the judge while she's presiding over real life cases. And what that does is it shows young people as young as 9 years old, actually, is our youngest, actually 7 years old, that one, they have access to the people who are looked at as the decision makers in that arena. Number two, it teaches them about the legal system from the other side of the bench, where they are not the perpetrator or the victim. And there is a demystifying that happens about what goes on in a court situation. And then number three, what it does is it increases our young people's net worth by increasing their network. And so now the folks that you have in your phone and in your email are the judges, the lawyers, the clerks, so on and so forth. And that drastically minimizes how they interact with that system, first and foremost. But then the fact that we have put a highlight on the prevention part in preventing young people from even touching that system in the first place will reduce the likelihood that they'll enter into that system. The other part of it is that the person that does the time is not the only person that we need to be considering. And I think a lot of the stuff that we create, and we as in New York City or New York State create, are avenues for the person who is incarcerated only. We have to look at that holistically if we really want to, one, reduce recidivism and include the entire family. When somebody does time, their wife does it with them, their husband does it with them, their mother, their children. And there is some legislation being introduced right now called post-traumatic prison disorder, Shawana 76337. And that bill stands to make sure that we're looking at folks and the families of folks who have been incarcerated, their mental health needs, and making sure that they are receiving all of not only the reentry services, but the emotional support services that they need. And I think people need to really be taking a look at post-traumatic prison disorder, Shawana 76337, because this legislation was also written out of a diary that she herself kept while incarcerated. Her cellmate set herself on fire and was killed right in front of her. So people in the prison system at that time ignored her mental health state as she told them that she was having all sorts of visions and trauma-induced visions and all of these things. So, to answer that question, smart legislation that looks at the entire family, also alongside prevention and building programs that completely deter our young people from being involved in the criminal justice system. They go hand in hand, and they're not, inextricably secluded from each other.
Thank you for that. I just want to kick it to Shaun quickly, just to see, to get your take before we move on to the next question.
Such heartbreaking, inspiring work, Shanequa. Thank you for sharing that. And look, I want to go back to what I said on the first question. I'm committed to actually solving these issues in the platform in a couple different ways. I want to be very specific about. We do need to not just reimagine policing, but reimagine our correction system. I believe we should have a pre-trial agency so that before anyone ends up in front of a judge, we should be focused on the prevention and diversion of incarceration in the first place. They shouldn't even end up at Rikers, right? And there are lots of examples we have of incredibly effective community-based efforts to do that. We just haven't had a mayor who's been able to scale them and really take them to every neighborhood so that we could actually solve this challenge. So that's a big piece of this. The second is really reinvesting on the back end. Karume, you talked about this. Think about this and you all are too young to remember this, but when I started as housing commissioner, a few years before that, under the Giuliani administration, the reentry policy was dropping folks on a street corner in Long Island City with a token, You may not even know what tokens are. That's how we used to pay for the subway in New York. You all are too young. But that's crazy, right? And so as housing commissioner, I took some of my housing vouchers. It was the first time this had ever been tried in the country. We gave them to folks coming out of Rikers. And the results were dramatic. A year later, 95% of those folks were stably housed, getting back to work, hadn't reoffended. BARD is doing such amazing work like this now. Just from housing, it dramatically changed the outcomes. Think about what we could do if we brought all the pieces together, right? We have great Neon. There are many, many great programs that are out there, efforts like what BARD is doing, but we just need to scale them. The last thing I would say on this is, there are some who say we can't afford this. My answer to this is we can't afford not to do this. You know what we spend right now per prisoner on Rikers, even with the increase that we've seen this past year? We're still spending over $400,000 per prisoner per year in our correction system. Think about that, over $400,000 and getting bad results. I worked with President Obama to close the most expensive prison in the world, Guantanamo. Rikers is the second most expensive prison in the world. And if we do this now, if we do this the way it should, we will have the resources. Here's my commitment in the plan. Within my first 2 years in office, we will have $500 million dedicated to these efforts. And by the end of my first term, $3 billion a year dedicated to the types of programs that we're talking about. That's 20% of the budget in criminal justice. And that is far more ambitious. Los Angeles has a really ambitious program to redirect 10%. I would double that at 20% by the end of my first term. That's my commitment in this plan, to make all the inspiring work we've just heard about available everywhere in this city.
Thank you for that, Shaun. And Stephanie, I want to come to you with this next question. Last summer, there was a lot of attention paid to gun violence, and many claim that there was a huge spike in shootings despite the city continuing to experience historic lows in crime. What are your thoughts about that focus on gun violence, and should we instead take a harm reduction approach toward that issue?
I believe that when we're having the conversation of gun violence, rather than ever even thinking about how we should be taking guns off of the streets, how we should be tackling that surface level issue of gun violence, we need to think about how we got here in the first place. And it has nothing to do with the Black and brown low-income communities in this city that are being affected by this issue, and everything to do with the extremely impoverished conditions that our neighborhoods have been placed in historically for decades. That's what has led to gun violence, to whatever other violence this question is referring to. That is what has led to it, not Black and brown low-income people just being inherently more violent and just happening to have more guns. It's the institutionalized poverty that has got us to where we are today and has impacted all aspects of our neighborhoods, of Black and brown low-income neighborhoods. So I think that if we're truly going to have a conversation about quote unquote gun control, we need to have a conversation about how we're going to tackle that long withstanding issue of institutionalized poverty and racism within our communities. And back to this reoccurring topic that we're mentioning, that means reallocating resources and investing in education, in healthcare, in food, in housing, in all of these things that truly make a healthy, strong community. And that's gonna mean taking away from a much larger budget like the NYPD budget. If we want to tackle the issue of mass incarceration in this city, if we want to tackle the issue of investing in education, if we want to tackle the issue of quote unquote gun control, we're going to have to take away from the NYPD's budget and reinvest that into the communities that the NYPD has been harming for a long time, and and that includes communities that are impacted by quote unquote gun violence. I also wanted to briefly mention in regards to our last question and the use of the quote unquote correctional system. It was never meant to correct anything. It was meant to harm Black and brown low-income communities. It was meant to punish people for being poor and for being Black. And it has been doing that since it was created, because it was created for that purpose. So I think that the answer to, again, quote unquote, gun control, the answer to police in schools, the answer to finding a solution for mass incarceration really starts with taking these issues from the root, and that means reinvesting into the different institutions that Black and brown low-income communities have been deprived of completely for decades. That's where we're going to see the truest, most genuine change. And I think that's what my answer to this question is. Everything goes back to taking away from the billionaire budgets of policing, of prisons, not correctional facilities, not because they were never correcting anything, but prisons. Taking away from those massive budgets and investing into the communities that they have most negatively impacted. And understanding that we were never violent. We were never inherently causing violence. Violence was being caused or perpetrated against us. And that is how this city got to where it is. That is how our communities got to where they are. It wasn't our fault. It was because for decades, on an institutional, systemic level, we have been disenfranchised.
Thank you, Stephanie. Never felt disappointed. I want to get Shanequa and Dyjuan before I kick it to Shaun for a response as well.
You know, Karume, I'll just say briefly that I'm never interested in having a conversation about gun violence that is focused on getting guns off the street, because I think we need to be as equally concerned in how the guns got onto the street, right? And so if we every time we're speaking about gun violence, we also need to be talking about gun control, right? How are guns getting onto the streets of New York City, right? And particularly into Black and brown neighborhoods. And if we look at the data, the most of those guns come from out of state, from states that have more lenient gun laws than New York State does. And so if we want to keep communities safe, maybe we should make it a real priority to keep guns from other states from crossing over into New York and landing in our most marginalized communities, right? And so it's really, really easy to reduce this down to individual conduct and said, you know, this guy woke up one day and was in a bad mood and made a bad decision and went out and used a gun. Or we can look at this systemically and say, whoa, why don't we take the option to use a gun to shoot someone off the table, right? Why don't we take the gun out of the dynamics in these communities? And so I think we need a really real push in New York City, in New York State, for stricter gun control and gun prevention, explicitly keeping guns out of our most marginalized communities. You know, that's how we reduce gun violence. You can't have gun violence without a gun.
So can I just pile on both of these from Dyjuan and from Stephanie as well? We have to recognize that we need a mayor who has the ability to reach beyond the borders of this city and shut down the gun pipeline, because they're not being sold here, they're being brought here. And we are being preyed on by predatory gun dealers in surrounding states. And I think one of the things that's unique about me as a candidate for mayor is I know almost every senior official in the Biden-Harris administration, including the president and vice president themselves. I've worked side by side with our leaders in Congress. I am close friends with senior folks at the Justice Department. I know Merrick Garland personally, and I would be a mayor that was on the phone every day, making sure that we are partnering with federal law enforcement to aggressively shut down that pipeline. Because I completely agree that this is something that we make a situation dramatically worse by the flooding of guns into Black and brown communities in this city. And I have personal friendships, could work with mayors across the country to build a movement to make those kind of changes. But at the same time, Stephanie's exactly right as well. And my platform treats gun violence through a public health lens that we never bring to it. And that has to change as well. And to invest, I talked about that $3 billion a year commitment to reinvest. That is something that would go to exactly the root causes in a way that I think is fundamental to this issue as well.
And Shaun, I kind of want to stick with you on this next question. As we're building on this theme of reinvestment and really reframing the discussion, I want to get everybody else's take as well. But many over time, many cities, including New York, have taken on really complex issues like violence prevention, mental health, substance abuse, community cohesion, and place them in the hands of the police. As we talk about reimagining NYPD, particularly in this time, what are the roles that the police should continue to play in our communities, and what alternatives are available to address those issues outside of policing?
Yeah, Karume, look, let me get personal for a second here. I grew up in this city in the 70s and 80s, again, dating myself compared to you young folks. And what lit a fire in me to be a public servant was walking past homeless folks on my way to school, seeing neighborhoods like the South Bronx and Central Brooklyn crumbling, in some cases, literally burning to the ground. And I asked myself, how can it be in the wealthiest city, in the wealthiest country on earth, we let New Yorkers sleep on our streets? And today we have more homeless folks in New York than since the Depression, since more than even when I was a kid growing up in this city. We are going backwards on these issues when we know how to solve them. And I will also say, this is personal. My sister was a psychiatrist who worked on a street team with the homeless. She worked in supportive housing. And for me, the most personal example is we have criminalized homelessness. I was talking with Shams DeBaron the other day, who was describing his asking the police for help to find services and shelter and ending up in handcuffs at the station, right? We have to fundamentally reimagine this system. This is part of my plan as well. We need to completely remake our 911 system, to divert calls to teams that are not the police, that actually are trained in de-escalation and mental health issues, that have access to all the services that we need. Dyjuan, you talked about the Fortune Society earlier. I'm a huge fan of their work. And I know that we can build this kind of system because, unlike any of the other candidates in the race, I've actually worked with mayors, leaders across the country. What I've seen, take Cahoots in Oregon. They've built an alternative to 911. They've built teams that can respond. And guess what? It turns out that in a tiny, tiny fraction of cases, those folks may be violent. And you can call the police in if there's guns involved, if somebody's life is in danger. But otherwise, treat the real problem, right? Which is a mental health challenge. And I see this over and over again. We talked about schools earlier. Let me give you another example. We've created what we call open streets in this city with COVID to give kids and families a chance to walk and play when they need access to fresh air and to be safe and healthy. 75% of those open streets in the city are the responsibility of the police to oversee. The other 25% are community organizations. We know they do a much better job. They program them well. They partner with community organizations to ensure that they're becoming places that are truly available to community members. Why are we asking the police to do that? This is where we should reduce their role in mental health crises, in the schools, in open streets, in many other areas. Focus them on guns and violent crime, the issues that Black and brown communities are actually focused on, where they want to be safe, and get the police out of jobs that they're doing now that they're not equipped for, and create deep underlying tensions with and violence with our students and with our homeless in many other ways. So that is a fundamental piece of this platform. And again, this is not rhetoric to me. I've actually walked the walk on this. I led the homelessness strategy for President Obama. We dramatically reduced homelessness. We saved money doing it. We can afford to do this. We know how to house anyone. Now we have to house everyone. And that's why I say we need to reimagine our right to shelter in this city as a right to housing. And I'm the only candidate that actually knows how to do that.
Thank you for that, Shaun. I want to leave space for Q&A here. But in the event that Shanequa, Stephanie, and Dyjuan, if all three of you have just brief take on that question before we go to the Q&A, and I'll turn it to Shanequa first.
Sure. So when we're talking about the issue of gun violence and having guns on our street, first and foremost, as a survivor of gun violence, we're not addressing the issue of structural and institutional racism, right? That play a part in how one human can devalue the life of another so drastically that they're using a gun in the first place. So the gun is a microcosm of a much larger issue. It's a microcosm of the fact that our music industry trains people of color to sing about killing each other and causing harm to each other. We're talking about the gun being a microcosm of a failed school system where I had to actually take my daughter out of the board of education 3 years ago and homeschool her full time because she was being taught in a charter school that Christopher Columbus was a great guy that discovered this place and found extra land for the Native Americans and moved them there because there wasn't enough room. This is a current problem, right? This is not an issue of 1962. This is only a couple of years ago where children are being taught these kinds of things in school. You couple that with the lack of food in our communities, the fact that we live in food deserts, and what people are consuming physiologically create aggression and create anger and create violent temperaments when there's no access to fresh fruits and vegetables and things that are grown that do not have, GMO processing, so on and so forth. So you couple all those things together. And that's where the problem is with one human using a weapon of any sort. In this instance, we just happen to be talking about guns. Those are the issues that really need to be addressed when we're talking about gun violence in a community. What is making people so angry to begin with? And when you put all of those things together to end on this note, and then you put people in a community where they do not have access to things like fresh air, or green grass, right? Like we all need to get away and lay under a tree or lay on some sand every once in a while. That is not the reality of our people in these communities. So we can talk about taking a gun off of a street. It still doesn't change the mentality of a person who wants to cause harm to someone else because they have not had the access to really examine, explore, unfold, or unpack their own mental health or emotional issues. And so if we're going to have a conversation about guns, there's absolutely no way that we can have that conversation in a silo away from all of those other external and structurally, racist practices that happen in our communities.
Thank you, Shanequa. And just in consideration of time, I want to turn this over to the Q&A just so we can get more of our audience members involved as well. I want to thank all of our panelists, Shaun, Donovan, obviously, Shanequa, Charles, Dyjuan, Tatro, and Stephanie Pacheco for this great discussion. I'll turn it over for our Q&A.
Thank you, Karume. Hi, everyone. My name is Yuridia Pena. I'm one of Shaun Donovan's senior advisors for the campaign. We have a couple of questions, and I will start with, and I apologize if I'm saying your name wrong, Taj Sutton. And this is for the group. It's asking, partnering with law enforcement, regardless of intent, will have the impact of disenfranchising young people like Stephanie, who spent the summer fighting for justice and being met with violence and vitriol. Are you prepared to defund the police and stand boldly in the face of opposition to reimagine public safety through the lens of budget allocation and resource equity? And I'll start with Shaun.
The answer is yes. And let me just say, again, this isn't just talk for me. I've walked this walk. I talked earlier about the decision I made as housing commissioner to redirect housing vouchers to folks coming out of Rikers. I took a lot of heat for that decision. And let me just be very frank. Folks said to me, how can you be prioritizing criminals over families that are waiting in line for housing vouchers? I've had that same question asked to me when I started as housing secretary for President Obama, to redirect housing and resources to folks that were suffering with mental health and substance abuse challenges. And people said to me, you're going to give drug addicts housing, this precious resource, before they stop using? The answer is, we cannot solve these underlying challenges. As Dyjuan said earlier, we can't solve them if people aren't clothed, if they don't have a place to sleep, if they don't have the basic needs of a life of opportunity. You are not going to solve these underlying challenges. And so we must redirect that funding, despite the kind of resistance I've heard over and over again in my career. And we must also prove that this will not only save lives, it will actually save money as well. People say we can't afford to do this. I say we cannot afford not to do this. Because just take homelessness as an example. We know, because where do folks that are sleeping in our streets get their health care? In emergency rooms. They end up cycling in and out of the very institutional settings that criminalize their behavior that we've just talked about. We have to end that cycle, and we can afford to do this. We can't afford not to do this. It is both unjust and it is wrong. We must put the justice back in our criminal justice system.
Great. Any of the other panelists want to weigh in on defunding the police, et cetera?
Yeah, I think whenever we're having a conversation around defund the police, we have to hold something in mind, especially in relationship to New York City, that policing in New York City is at a scale seen in no other city in this country, no other city in the world, right? And so the problem around police budgets and the amount of funding that goes to police is really, really exceptional in New York City, right? And so whenever we're talking about this, need everyone to hold that kind of in their head, that New York City is a special case when it comes to this. But in particular, in respect to the question, I think there's a part in there that talks about, kind of systemic racisms in policing. And so we can have a conversation about, we can keep police out of mental health. We can keep them out of homelessness. I think those out of schools, those are things that we can reasonably agree on. Where the issue becomes a little more contentious is when we talk about deconstructing institutionalized racisms, right? And so the question really is, what can we trust the police to do, right? And the fact is that we can't trust them to do much in a way that is not racist, right? 70% of the summonses issued in New York City for jaywalking are in the South Bronx, right? Are in the South Bronx, 70%. This past year, when it comes to COVID enforcement, social distancing guidelines, even this is a public health issue in the middle of a pandemic, and the NYPD took that as an opportunity to disproportionately target African-American minority communities, despite the fact that the majority of complaints were in white communities, right? And so when we're talking about these issues, we must be very, very clear that there's a racial dynamic here that has to be addressed parallel with the issues of homelessness, with mental health, with police and school, right? And so I just really want to surface that because I think in New York City, it is going to be the thing that if we can resolve, right? If we can take kind of the racist impetus out of policing, that policing in this city is going to become a much less contentious issue.
Great. Stephanie, I see your hand. Do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I just quickly feel inclined to throw in that with all this mention of the South Bronx and low-income areas, I'm from the South Bronx. My family was in the Bronx when the Bronx was on fire. So all of this that we're talking about is my reality. Every single day is my reality. And with that, I want to say that not only does the NYPD have aspects of systemic racism, it is the systemic racism. The NYPD itself is a system of racism. And I like to challenge the wording of reimagining the NYPD. I'm like not sure what there is to reimagine. I can't imagine reimagining a system that was built on slavery. I think the only solution is to start taking away funds from the NYPD and reinforcing it into communities. Again, I'm like a broken record. I think that that is like the only viable solution, or at least the only viable first step, because the NYPD doesn't fill in the gaps that people like think it does. And not only should we be reducing how they handle like mental health and homelessness situations, they shouldn't be doing it at all, ever. That is not what they like. That's not what they should be doing at all. So when reimagining public safety, we need to understand that the NYPD has never, ever kept the public safe, because that's not what policing was meant for. Policing was created in this country for the purpose of harming Black people, and it has been doing that since it was created. So if we want to tackle this issue, we're gonna have to tackle it from the root, because any other form of going about it isn't tackling it at all. So that's why I believe that we as a city need to be ready to defund the police and fund the institutions that are really what keep communities safe. Because the safest communities don't have the most cops, they have the most resources. They have the best education, they have healthcare, they have food, they have housing. That's what keeps them safe, not the NYPD walking around with machine guns and riot gear and ready to body slam Black students as they're trying to get to and from school because they can't pay $275. I would much rather be entertaining a conversation of how we're going to invest in things that are actually going to solve these problems of poverty, of marginalization, because the NYPD has never and really will never serve these purposes, because it wasn't designed that way. And when we're talking about the system, when we're talking about the system of policing, when we're talking about the system, when we're talking about the prison system, or when we're talking about all these systems, we can't think that they're broken, because they're not broken. They were designed this way. They were designed to kill and disenfranchise and imprison Black people. And they have been doing that since they were created. So if we really want to tackle these issues, we're going to have to pull them out from the root. And that means defunding, that means reallocating, that means reinvesting in our communities in the way that America has never done. And I think that that's the real solution.
That's great, Stephanie. And actually that's a great segue for the next question for Shaun, which is from Griffin Kelly. Thank you. When we say defund the police, exactly how much do you think should be taken out of their budget and allocated to other services and agencies?
So, as I said earlier, my commitment is to get to $3 billion a year. The most aggressive proposal we've seen in the country is 10% within 4 years. I'm committing to get to 20% within 4 years. And we should be clear, it is not just what I'm looking at, the entire criminal justice budget that needs to be reallocated and moved. Not just the police, but our correction system, as I said earlier, as well. We have to be focused on both of them.
I think with that, that might be our closing point there. And want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank Shanequa Charles, Dyjuan Tatro, Stephanie Pacheco, who apparently some people want to recruit for a future mayoral run, and Shaun 2021, Stephanie 2029, maybe. And of course, Shaun Donovan, this has been a great conversation to be a part of. Thank you all for such an open, thoughtful, and engaged and candid discussion. And I hope everyone has a really great day. It's been an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Karume.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Karume, Dyjuan, Shanequa, Stephanie. Amazing. Thank you.
Family, peace.
Shaun, you're great. Love the plan.
John
Thank you.
for NYC, go read the plan.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.